Three people that I want you to know from the ancient Near East. This was really more appropriate for last week, but you're getting it this week. Sorry. The first one is Sargon. You need to know Sargon. Remember, the Sumerians were the first ones to create a civilization in the Fertile Crescent. The other thing you need to know about Sargon is that he had a miraculous birth narrative. Miraculous birth narratives are important. Why? Who else gets miraculous in birth narratives? Think the Bible.
Jesus.
How about Moses? Anybody ever heard of him? How about Samson? Samuel? And of course, if you're a Christian, Jesus with an H. The miraculous birth narrative after Sargon becomes an important literary topos. It's a commonplace that's designed to tell the reader, sit up and pay attention, because only great people get miraculous birth narratives. Sargon is the one that broke the mold. The second person from antiquity that I want you to know is Hammurabi. Hammurabi is from the old Babylonian kingdom, and his significance, what he is known to history for, is the promulgation of a law code. That is important because of the promulgation of the Torah in the biblical material. Important parallels between the code of Hammurabi and the biblical, the Mosaic Torah. Then the third one is Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaten. What's important about this guy was that in the middle, right in the middle of Egyptian life, polytheistic Egyptian life, he establishes a monotheistic religion. Changes his name, moves the capital, creates tremendous upheaval in Egyptian life. Amenhotep is important because of the monotheism, because that monotheism seems to be at least as old as biblical monotheism. And in fact, many people have suggested that biblical monotheism comes as a result of the influence of the religion of Amenhotep / Akhenaten. But it's also important because of the Amarna letters. There is a whole series of correspondence that still exists from the monarchy and the government in Egypt to its vassals in the Canaanite city-states that give us a window in the middle of the second millennium into life inside what was biblical Canaan from the perspective of Canaanites, and thus gives us the flavor of life in the second millennium BCE. So it's very important. I promise you, you will see these three on your midterm exam. I swear to you. Any questions about them? All right. Things you need to know about the primeval history. First of all, you need to know about the story of Cain and Abel. The story of Cain and Abel is basically this. Two brothers, children of Adam and Eve, both of them bring offerings to the Lord. One of them brings an offering of the fruit of the ground. The other one brings an animal. And it turns out that God likes the animal, prefers the blood. No reason is given for this. One might infer that the preference for the blood is something that prefigures or foreshadows the appreciation later on that we'll obtain for the divinity in terms of the divinity's appreciation for blood sacrifice in and around the temple cult. But none of that is on the horizon at the beginning of Genesis. But as a result of the appreciation for the blood offering as opposed to the fruit and grain offering, the one brother kills the other. So the first thing out of Eden, there is the fall to violence. And humanity sets upon one another rather than living peaceably as would seem to have befit the people living on the edge. When there's only a handful of people in the world, you'd think you wouldn't kill one of the only people, and that one's survival would be connected to the other. But that's not the way the story goes. Secondly, there's the story of the biblical flood. And it's very interesting when you read the reasons for the flood. Well, first of all, it's interesting because you're not 6 chapters into the Bible and God is already changing God's mind. The idea of an absolutely consistent, unchanging being, Genesis doesn't know anything about that God. This God is already sorry that he's made people the way that he has and decides that he's going to start over from scratch. And the reason that the reason that the text says God is going to do this is because of violence. Apparently the kind of violence that takes place amongst Cain and Abel is not isolated to Cain and Abel, but is also broken out amongst the rest of society. And the people who were created in the image of God are now set about effacing the image of God in one another. And God decides God's going to start all over again. And it's kind of convoluted on several counts because there's actually not one flood story, but 2 flood narratives. And you get one flood narrative where people are going on in certain numbers, or the animals are going on in certain numbers, and they're another flood narrative in which they're going on in certain other configurations. It's one of those places where the J and the E document, the J and the P documents, are both intertwined and have been redacted together in chapters 6 through 9. 2 other things of note in that section. One that Collins mentions is the Nephilim, which we don't really know what the Nephilim are, which is why the Hebrew word is used even in a lot of modern translations. Some of the older translations would translate it giants, but it's not really the word giants. The concept that they might be giants is something that is inferred from the text, not something that is implicit in the word Nephilim itself. Who these Nephilim are, these legendary men of old, of mighty and powerful deeds, who are so dangerous. We have no idea who these people are, but that's one of those concepts that has launched 1,000 screenplays, because you can posit whatever you want as being the definition of Nephilim. We don't know who these people are. Secondly, the interesting part of this is the story of Noah's drunkenness. And in Noah's drunkenness, his son Ham, one of his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, one of his three sons views his nakedness. Now, what happens in that situation is of wide speculation. Did Ham actually look upon Moses being naked? That's one view that pops up in the history of interpretation. Another one is that Ham witnesses Noah masturbating. You can see why you can't preach this. Then there's in the other one, looking upon one's nakedness is in other parts of the scripture is understood as envisioning the sexual act. So potentially this is Ham saw Noah and his mother have sex. That's another possibility. Another possibility is that Ham had homosexual intercourse with his father in the midst of his drunkenness. Those are the main four lines of interpretation of what is encountered there. Whatever it was that Ham saw/did, it results in a curse. And the curse on Ham is actually made against the son, is actually falls upon the son of Ham, that is Canaan, and Canaan's children and descendants are foretold to be the servants of his brothers, Shem and Japheth, throughout all their days. That particular passage in Genesis chapter 9 was used all the way down until the modern period as a theological justification for slavery. That God intended for blacks to serve the interests of other people because of the sin of Ham. And that interpretation can be found both within Judaism and in Christianity, and was alive and well all the way throughout the 19th century, up into and in fact beyond the Civil War. And there's a very interesting book that if you want to read a book, if you're looking for a recommendation, I'll throw one out there to you. It's written by Stephen Mackenzie. Oh, it's not Mackenzie. Stephen Haynes, on that particular passage on the sin of Ham and the curse of Ham by Noah. And it goes through the whole history of the interpretation of that passage within Judaism and Christianity. And it's quite disturbing. Now we would look at something like that and say that's absolutely ridiculous. But for most of the history of Western culture, particularly in the South, in colonial America and in the United States, that was viewed as God's word. And that this was based on that long ago slight, whatever it was, that blacks were supposed to be subservient to whites. Then there is the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. The Tower of Babel is an obvious reference to the ziggurats of Babylon, the kind of step pyramids that were used in that part of the world, and the step pyramid is viewed by the biblical writer to be an attempt to make the people like God, and to sort of continue the project of that got the people in trouble in the Garden of Eden in the first place. You remember that was what the serpent said. You know, it's not going to kill you if you get this information. That in fact all you'll do is just get a little bit more information. You'll be much closer to God, and it won't do anything to damage you. When in fact it was something of a whole other order. Genesis 11 is sort of the bookend to this, to that account of the story in the Garden of Eden, where the hubris of humanity and the desire to be like God, the desire to be great like God, the desire to have a name like God, is seen to be a part of the damaging human condition. The part, rather than making humanity like God, it's that which alienates humanity from God, for which God casts the people down by confounding their speech and causing them to be unable to understand one another, thus causing their dispersion across the land, they being unable to finish the project that the step pyramid or ziggurat had originally inaugurated. You will need to know these events of the primeval history. I'm not going to ask tremendous detail, but you need to know, the creation, the garden story, the Cain and Abel story. You need to know the flood, and you need to know the Tower of Babel. You should be able to put those events in order of chronology. All right? Now, one of the things that proliferate in the book of Genesis are etiologies. Etiologies, broadly construed, are how things came to be, how things got their name, how a set of circumstances came to be the way they are, how a group of people came to be the way that they are. And they're all over the place in Genesis. One of the earliest is in Genesis 2. It's funny because this one pops up a lot of times in the context of my own denomination about the issue of gay marriage, because the text says, therefore a man shall leave his father and a woman shall leave her home, and the two shall become one flesh. It's an etiology of how marriage begins. But rather than reading it as an etiology, it has often been hijacked. Instead of being descriptive of something, it is hijacked by people for purposes of their own theological agenda and political agenda, and made into a proscriptive statement. So rather than describing what is the norm, instead it is the norm, and everybody has to follow the norm. Very different than reading Genesis 2 as an etiology, which it is originally. Not that the people of Genesis 2, whoever wrote Genesis 2, would count it as gay marriage. That isn't the point. The point is that that's not what this literature is. That's not what that literary genre is not about what we're supposed to do. It's simply a description of what is, which may or may not be the right thing. It's just a description. Another one is what we discussed last week, the pain in childbirth for the woman. It comes as a result of the eating of the tree that had been forbidden by God, of the knowledge of good and evil. Same thing with the Adam having to toil by the sweat of his brow. That's an etiology for how human work relates to human survival and human sustenance. You are in that condition of having to work, according to the story, as a result of having eaten from this tree. And then lastly, another prime example is the situation of the Tower of Babel. It's a story that presents as a means of God beating back the inappropriate desires and imaginations of humankind in their attempt to be like God. But what it also ends up doing is explaining why I don't speak Chinese and why you don't speak Hebrew. Because we all, in our ancestors, at the Tower of Babel, and God confounded our language so that we wouldn't build that ziggurat to the sky and make ourselves like God. Each one of those are etiologies. You need to be able to identify what an etiology is for your midterm exam. Again, I promise you will see this. All right? Moving right along because we have to.
Hey, Tim.
What?
Did you move the Chick-fil-A cup? Because I'm trying to record it and your face has become the Chick-fil-A cup.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have become the Chick-fil-A cup. There's a metaphor in there somewhere. The jokes virtually write themselves. The patriarchal narratives. I'm going to say a few things about that before we come down to the close of the class. The patriarchal narratives are from Genesis 12 through 50. The most important of the patriarchal narratives is that Abram and Sarai become Abraham and Sarah, and they become the founders of God's new thing. In Genesis 12, God decides to start all over again. After the flood, he's up until the beginning, he's been working through all of humanity. But in Genesis 12, God decides God's not going to work through all of humanity simultaneously. Instead, God is going to pick one family and is instead going to work through that one family to bring about God's will in the world. This is the way the story presents itself, as God's plan B. God having learned that the other way was not going to be successful. Now, ostensibly, the Abraham story takes place circa about 2100 BCE. That is, if you follow biblical chronology, if you add up how many years happened from this point to how many years happened to that point, and so on. I'm sorry, that's just the best place to put my drink. I have to put it on my left side because I can't see out my right eye, and I'll knock my drink over. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Sorry. It presents as being from that period, but it's very difficult when you try to corroborate that date. It's very hard to substantiate any kind of claim for such a dating. Abram comes from, is a strange guy, takes a strange route from a very strange place. Now, I'll show you what I mean on this particular slide. Abram ostensibly comes from the city of Ur of the Chaldees. You see where that is. In other words, brace yourself, but Abram was an Iraqi. That'll ought to piss some people off. And he then moves to Syria. Again, a lovely, lovely place. And then from there he moves to Canaan. This is not the route that you'd normally think if you were Abram's travel agent and you were booking his Greyhound bus. You wouldn't book him on this route, but this is the route that ostensibly in the biblical text that he takes. the strangeness of the person and the place from which he comes a lot of times gets set aside, but it is presented in the biblical view as a sign of great faith, because there's no Google Maps, there's no websites, thelonelytraveler.com. There's not a Fedora's or a Baedeker guide to tell you all the restaurants and shops to go to and what the best bus routes are to get to the tourist attractions, and what the proper price that you should pay in bartering for something at a marketplace, and which marketplace is going to rip you off and which market is going to give you fair. There's nothing like that for Abram. Abram is presented as following simply the call and voice of God to get up out of a place of comfort, a place that he knew, and to go to a place that he'd never been before, that he had no reason to expect would be successful, that he would be safe or be prosperous, but that he simply gets up and goes and follows God, is what makes Abram the exemplar of faithfulness, and is in part the reason why this whole religious tradition gets built on the shoulders of this man and his wife as people who faithfully follow God. And the story of that faithfulness will not just be concluded with his transformation, with his translocation from Ur of the Chaldeans all the way to the land of Canaan, but will continue with several other events, including waiting many long years for the birth of the child, and then the demand by this Abram's God that Abram kill that child once that child is born. And it is as a result of that one's faithfulness that he will become the chief person in the religion. Somebody had a question or comment?
Well, someone was blessing someone, which is very sweet because they sneezed.
Oh. Blessing is, in the context of a class on the biblical text, is appropriate. You know that's the name of your president, right? Barak. To bless.
Could that be Baruch? I think Barak means thunder, Hebrew.
Yeah, but they're all cognates. They're BRK. Faith, Resh, Kof. Depends on what you're
but Baruch is.
It's coming from the Arabic, not the Hebrew. His father was a Muslim. Remember, the Republicans remind us every day. His middle name is Hussein. He's not a Baruch. He's a Barak. Early hopes for historical corroboration. Now this is Albright. Okay, this is what Albright had hoped to prove. Remember W.F. Albright, the father of so-called biblical archaeology. The hopes were that that the evidence of Amorites, it should be singular, the Amorite migrations. There's evidence that we have in extra biblical material that there was a push from the east to the west of the tribes, the groups of people known as the Amorites, of which Abram is said to have been have had some connection, however tenuous. What we found, however, was that those migrations took place not just in and around 2100 BCE, but several times, both before and after 2100, thus shooting down that, that's what Albright hypothesized, is that Abram was part of this larger migration of lots of people who were moving at that time from the east to the west. A second one was found at the city of Mari, what sociologists call dimorphic, or anthropologists call dimorphic societies. That is, societies where you have where you have a regular group of people living in cities, and you have a regular group of people living outside of cities in a nomadic life, and the two living in a kind of symbiosis. And as Collins points out, that is definitely what you find when you read Genesis. However, as Collins also points out, we have examples of that persist all the way into the 21st century. If you go to southern Israel and Palestine, even to this day, you will find Bedouin Arabs living a nomadic life. It drives the Israeli government absolutely bonkers that they can't get these people to stop living a nomadic life, and they try to get them to move into some sort of settled housing and that sort of thing. It drives them crazy that they won't, but they continue to do so and will not go live in a city, a city proper, the way that the Israeli government would like them to. That's an example of something. We have dimorphic societies even to this day. And the parallel that Albright originally thought existed there between the way that the city structure and the country structure of life in antiquity, that mirrored Genesis. It did mirror Genesis, but so do 100 other instances. And you wouldn't necessarily be able to prove the historicity of the Bible from the existence of modern day Bedouin Arabs. And then there was the situation at Nuzi, which is another ancient Near Eastern site. Is one of the Hurrian cities. At Nuzi, we have examples of two things. One, we have examples of a legal tradition in which a barren wife is required by law to present her husband with a fertile surrogate by which that the husband can have children. And this looked like a big deal, because that's the story of Abram and Sarai. Sarai was unable to bear children, and so Abram took their slave Hagar and impregnated Hagar and had with her the son Ishmael. And thus, when the Nuzi texts were found, people said, "Oh, we got something here." Except that they kept looking, and as they searched around in other ancient Near Eastern contexts, that turned out to be a fairly commonplace legal requirement in a variety of ancient Near Eastern societies, both before and after Nuzi, thus not being something special. It was, so you could say, well, that has the ring of historicity. There were societies in the ancient Near East where that did take place, but you couldn't date anything by that bit of information. The second piece that looked tantalizing upon first glance was situations in which a sister could be presented as a wife and vice versa. Because this happens several times amongst the patriarchs. In fact, it ends up happening 3 times, twice to Abraham and once to his son Isaac, where they present themselves, and the woman in their lives, they present themselves as being, this is my sister, when in fact it's their wife. But because it is also their sister, depending on how you lay out genealogical things, they're like half-sisters, what you get was a little bit of deception, because this was not some sort of legal norm that is being observed. As Collins notes, what is in view in this particular situation, in the biblical situations, is that the patriarchs were in a jam, and they were in front of dangerous men who might kill them in order to take their beautiful wives from them. So this wasn't an instance, as it is in the laws of music, of sisters being legal wives. It's an instance rather of the patriarchs quaking in their boots and thus coming up with some sort of last-minute harebrained explanation in order to get themselves out of a jam. And thus, the totality of this meant, and that as scholars looked at these things, over time, what looked to be, at first blush, like back in the 1920s and 1930s, when Albright first suggested that the Abrahamic narratives were historical. People thought, wow, these were really big deals. But then further study caused all of those things to get chopped down. So that by the time of the end of Albright's career, even Albright had to himself acknowledge that the Abrahamic narratives weren't historical, or at least could not be demonstrated historically based upon any of the available evidence of the time. And thus he had to, at the end of his life, retract a lot of the work that he had done, which was extremely painful for him and was something painful for his students who held up Albright in such tremendous regard, thus that they wanted to try to preserve and salvage his legacy by proving the next best thing, which was proving the Exodus, as we talked about earlier this evening. The Abiru, or the Apiru. This is one of these interesting things that we're not sure we know very much about, but that present tantalizing historical clues. Genesis 14:13 refers to Abram the Hebrew, and it is a well-attested second millennium term for any marginal people. That is the term Abiru or the term Apiru. The term in Hebrew is Ibri. So it's closely related, but not exactly. But we have all kinds of examples from the second millennium BCE of these marginal folk. They're not an ethnic group. So this is not any kind of nationality or race or anything like that. It's any group of people that are on the fringes, that are on the margins of society, and they can be referred to as Abiru or Apiru. And so the question is Abram and his crew, are they part of these marginal folk? So that if you showed up in the second millennium BCE, would you have thought, and you encountered Abram, would you have thought, I'm in the presence of an Apiru? No, we don't know. We don't. It's one of those questions that leaves hanging in the air. We don't yet have enough data, but it looks like that's what the origin of the term Hebrew may be. You'll need to know. I will ask you about the Apiru, and this passage in Genesis. I will ask you this on your midterm. Again, it's a promise. I hope you're writing stuff down when I say stuff like that. It's not that other things won't be, that I can promise you. I'm already putting the test together in my head. I was doing it while I was taking a shower. And I'm thinking of all the trick questions I can compose to throw your mind into confusion, like at the Tower of Babel. All right, we really got to hurry. Here are some of the reasons for doubting the historicity of the Genesis narrative, besides the fact that the patriarchal narratives didn't pan out the way that people the way that Albright thought that they would. Here are some of the reasons that are the irrefutable evidence that Albright could not overcome, in addition to having his own claims undermined. First of all are the Philistines. The problem with the date of 2100 BCE for the biblical chronology is that we know when the Sea Peoples or the Philistines landed on the coast of the Levant, and that was in the 1200s BCE. So you're off by about 1,000 years. But you've got Philistines in the Abraham story. Okay, so that would be about as weird as finding George Washington having lunch with Beowulf. Okay, that's the kind of time frame you're dealing with. One of these things is not like the other. I mean, you all were raised on Sesame Street. There's a big problem there, and we've got lots of evidence about the Sea Peoples. But here they are. They're in Genesis 21. You've got the Philistines at a time where they don't belong. Secondly, Aramaeans. It's not as bad, but it's close. The Aramaeans, we know about the Aramaeans from the 17th century BCE. So there's a problem of about 500 years. So about a distance between you and Christopher Columbus. It's an anachronism to have Aramaeans in this text around Abraham. Third, camels. You got the same problem with camels. We know approximately when domesticated camels start appearing in the record, and it's about 1,000 years after the time that the story of Abraham purports to have taken place. That is around 1100 BCE. We start getting evidence both in terms of bones. You get bones around like watering holes and that sort of thing of camels, and in proliferation, as well as texts that talk about domesticated camels. And prior to that, you're dealing with wild camels, but supposedly camels are given as a gift in the Abraham story 1,000 years before we have domesticated camels. If you're a biblical scholar, this is just like raising, huge red flags. And then lastly, the Ur of the Chaldeans. Again, the city of Ur is ancient, but Ur of the Chaldeans is not. The Ur of the Chaldeans is actually a first millennia term. So it's you're dealing with people from 900 to 700 BCE is more of the time range of the Ur of the Chaldeans. You could just have Ur as an ancient city. If you'd just referred to it as Ur, that's one thing. But to refer to it as Ur of the Chaldeans, that's a date stamp for the Chaldean Empire. And the Chaldean Empire is 1,200 to 1,400 years later after the time of this narrative. And thus there's no way Abram got up out of the Ur of the Chaldeans and then went to Canaan. Didn't happen like that. No way, no how. He might have gotten up from the city of Ur, but not from Ur of the Chaldeans. Didn't happen like that. And thus, if you're a scholar, you read this, and if you know those other fixed data points, when you encounter something like this, it's not that the scholars are being they're like God-hating, religion-hating atheists. That's what happens a lot of times when people hear that scholars will question the historicity of this or that biblical passage. It's not that people are being churlish or that they're being anti-religious. It's rather that in the normal ways that one does history, one is able to mark certain events and create a set of signposts that guide one in the construction of a chronology. And unless one is going to do what we called last week special pleading, that is, oh, please, please don't apply these standards, the normal standards of history, to my religion. Unless we're going to engage in special pleading, you have to do history the same way for your religion as you would for somebody else's or for any other historical matter. And when one does this, this is what one comes up with. Now, could it happen that tomorrow somebody finds a text in which we find in 2200 BCE text in which you have a discussion of domesticated camels? Could that be found? Absolutely. Would it be possible if you found some reference to Ur of the, I don't know how you'd possibly get Ur of the Chaldees. It would be like Washington, D.C. before there was a Washington. But you get what I'm saying. It is possible to imagine scenarios in which you could find new data that would ditch this and cause somebody to rethink what had been discarded. That is, and maybe bring back, that statement at least about camels. That's the most likely one to be overturned. Of these on this page right here, that we'll find some ancient text, or somebody will dig up some archaeological site that will have a whole plethora of camel bones, which is what you get when you domesticate camels. You end up with lots of dead camels, and you end up with their remains in and around your campfire, and in and around your mid or your place where you do your trash. You find a proliferation of those in sites where they had domesticated camels. We may find that tomorrow. So just because tonight we don't have that data doesn't mean we won't. But it means currently, at the present time, there's no way to corroborate historically the historicity of the Abrahamic narrative. All right, I'm not going to give you a break. I'm just going to plow through till we finish, and we may finish a couple minutes early. The most important aspects of the Abraham storyline. You need to know the Abraham storyline like you need to know the primeval history. The first of all is the promise of a child and a great name. And furthermore, that the offspring of Abram and Sarah will be as the stars of the heaven and as the sand of the sea. So it isn't just one child, but there would be at least one child in order to have seed as the stars of the heaven, the sand of the sea. At least you got to have one baby. The cutting of a covenant. That is, God makes a promise, and God makes the covenant with Abraham, and the Abrahamic covenant is in the making of a covenant with Abraham. The Abrahamic covenant is a fertility covenant. What is the sign of the Abrahamic covenant? Circumcision. And how is that a sign of a fertility covenant? Nobody wants to touch that one with a 10-foot pole. All right. Well, here's the anthropological, because we have a lot of ancient societies circumcised. The anthropological analogy is that in the same way that one prunes a fruit tree in order that it will enhance its productivity of fruit, the belief amongst primitive people is that the pruning of the foreskin of the penis will enhance the productivity of the seminal flow, and thus mirroring the act of tree pruning in the sexual organs of the male. That's what the Abrahamic covenant is. I'm going to make of you a great nation. I'm going to make of you a great name, and your seed, that is literally your semen, will be as the stars of the heaven and as the sand of the sea. That's how much semen you're going to have. Because the word for semen and seed are one and the same in Hebrew.
Could it also be thought of as an offering? Blood.
Say more about that.
Blood offering?
I know what you
Sort of circumcision.
Well, it could be.
Covenant.
It could be. All I'm suggesting is the cross culture. Yes, definitely within Hebrew culture, it will be considered that kind of a blood offering. But more broadly construed anthropologically, cross-culturally, it would be considered a fertility rite designed to enhance the prowess and potency of the male organ. The third aspect is the trying out and rejecting of a substitute child. That is the child of the bond slave Hagar, and in the binding of Isaac, where after finally the child after the old age of Abraham and Sarah, finally the child is born, and no sooner is the child born than God says to go kill it, thus precipitating this huge theological crisis, in which the founder of the religion turns out to be a complete nut. I mean, because if Abraham lived today, and he said, officer, God told me to kill my child. That happens all the time. There are people in prison, there are people on death row in this country who heard the same thing that Abraham heard. And we think that they're either crazy or they're criminals. But inside this story, this is the sine qua non of faith, the sign beyond which there is no other. This is the sign that, I really, really, really super duper love God. And the tradition holds him up. And Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him as righteousness. Because God likes fanatics. Think about that the next time you hear Bill Maher criticize Islam. Anyway, don't get me started. So we're coming down to the end. Legend rather than history. Instead of Genesis being history, following Hermann Gunkel, we understand the book of Genesis as being legend. History deals with public occurrences, while legends deal with the personal. Even when the legends deal with public occurrences, which they occasionally do, they deal with the personal ramifications of the public occurrence. Legends originally are oral rather than written, and thus what you get history generally gets recorded and solidified in terms of its content, whereas things that are oral, there's still lots of play in them. So there's things that are transmitted orally. The kids love to play that game telephone. I don't know if you may have played it as a child, where you tell one person something, you whisper it, and then you wait to see what it comes out all the way on the other end. Legends are like that, because oral transmission, you don't ever get everything in oral transmission. You get things differently. People hear it differently. It gets recounted differently, so you get variation. There's wobble in legend rather than uniformity. The purest criterion, according to Gunkel, is that legends report the incredible. Not always, but they take things like 100-year-old men and 90-year-old women having a baby. They present that as fact. the focus shifts from what happened to why and where was this told. Die Sitz im Leben. That is, when you're looking at something as legend, when you're looking at something as history, we talked about this both the first and second weeks of class. Who, what, where, how, when, and why. Those are the questions that you ask when you're doing history. When you're doing analysis of a legend, you want to know what is the setting, the Sitz im Leben, the situation in life. This is Gunkel's major contribution. Instead, you try to figure out what would be the situation in which a story about a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman having a baby, a promised baby, what would be the situation in life in which such a story would be constructed and told in a way that would make sense, such that people would want to remember it and recount it and tell it to the next generation. Gunkel is the master of legend analysis in the book of Genesis. In fact, he has a book called The Legends of Genesis. If you're looking for something, if you're just dying to read Hermann Gunkel, you could read that profitably as one of for your critical review. There are different types of legends. There are etiological legends, that is how a certain set of circumstances came to be. Ethnological legends, that is how a certain group of people came to be in the situation they are, like why the descendants of Cain continued to roam the earth. There's an etymological legend, such as in Genesis 22, Yahweh Yirah. If you're from the west side of Jacksonville, it's not Yahweh Yirah, it's Jehovah Jireh. There isn't anybody named Jehovah up there, but they don't tell anybody on the west side of that. But because it's the text, it's the story of the binding of Isaac, and the text says that the place is given the name Yahweh Yirah because that is, the Lord will provide, and that in fact it's not the verb isn't provide, it's that the Lord will see to it. The Lord sees. That is an etymological legend, the Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac. And there's a ceremonial legend, how it is that we came to be doing the Passover in Exodus chapter 12, the most holy ritual within Judaism, the communal ritual of the people at Passover. That is a ceremonial legend. And then I think we're down to the last slide here.